Let's bring in Mike Allen. He's the co-founder of Axios. He, for many years, wrote for Politico's Playbook, and he joins us now to talk about all this. So, Mike, and we should clarify for our viewers, we perhaps showed a banner where we sort of quoted Paul Ryan saying he's not resigning, but of course, as Major Garrett and others have confirmed, the House Speaker is not seeking re-election come November. So, just so our viewers understand what we're reporting here. Mike, what do you make of the news out of D.C.?
Yeah, so Axios broke this story this morning, and our source described it to us as a titanic tectonic shift. Let's step back a little bit and think about what this means for Republicans. As your viewers well know, Republicans already struggling in the midterm elections. I think any odds maker would tell you that their chances of holding the majority less than 50-50. Democrats likely to take the House majority. Republicans themselves would tell you. And so now this sends such a signal. So one person said to us, now every Republican donor will think the House can't be held. So what Ryan, friends and confidants who talk to Axios will tell you is that there was no good time, that he was contemplating either a swim majority or a minority, and he decided that it was time to turn the page, have some time in private life. His big live stream, and I've covered Speaker Ryan back to when he was a congressman many years ago, had been to pass tax reform. He did that, so he's headed back to his family in Wisconsin.
So, Mike, what is the feeling moving forward, though? We've already seen a pretty long list of Republicans saying that they're not going to run for re-election. What do we expect now moving forward? Do you think that this could perhaps open the floodgates for more other people who might have been on the fence about staying or leaving?
Yeah, so there are financial markets and there are political markets. And what is the political market saying? The political market is saying, and flee was the perfect word that you just used, like Republican leaders emptying out. And it's partly because of the sort of bleak prognosis for the party as they look ahead, but also frustration with the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. President Trump and Speaker Ryan had reached sort of a truce, and the Speaker did not attack or needle the president. His thinking about that always was, I can go to the president and try and talk him into or out of decisions if I'm not out there as a persistent enemy. But certainly Paul Ryan, coming from a very different ideological place than the president and having plenty of disagreements.
Mike, I wonder if, taken from another perspective, that of President Trump's supporters, and given that the president, when he was a candidate, campaigned on what he called draining the swamp, and that's what some of his supporters have always wanted to see, that given the number of incumbent Republicans that are not seeking re-election this coming November, from the perspective of the Trump voter, does this look like that is happening, the draining of the swamp?
No, it's an interesting way to look at it. It just becomes very hard for your president to accomplish what he wants to if he has the minority at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. And that's why we've been saying for a long time that every day was precious for President Trump when Republicans controlled all of Washington, both the Senate and the House. You look back at both President George W. Bush, 43, the president's immediate predecessor, President Barack Obama. When was the time that they really accomplished big things? It was in the first year or two of their presidency when they held majorities. After that, everything becomes very hard. So when you are a president and you have the majority, you can't sleep and you can't afford all the distractions that this Republican establishment has had.
Major, Ed O'Keefe sort of talked about this a little bit. Now that he's going to be a lame duck speaker, what does that mean? And we've certainly seen a handful of Republicans who have announced that they're not going to run for re-election suddenly become much more critical of the president. What do you make? You know Paul Ryan's personality. Sure. Do you think you could see that sort of evolution happening? Certainly at those press conferences, the media would ask him over and over again about some of the more controversial things that the president had tweeted or said, and he really was very careful and cagey about any sort of commentary.
Sure. As Nancy has experienced many, many times up close, as Ed has watched, as Mike well knows, and as Mike just summarized, the speaker has sort of gone through a process that a lot of Republicans who are in prominent positions in Congress have had to go through. And it's essentially a fundamental, almost existential choice. Do you criticize the president when you believe he should be criticized, or do you not? Because believing he should be criticized and criticizing him doesn't change his behavior. It only makes him more antagonistic toward you, and as a result, slows down or halts your agenda. So many Republicans have gone through this process of telling themselves to focus on the agenda, and to advance the agenda means don't be critical of President Trump. Don't pick fights that you would fight under any other set of circumstances with any other Republican. They just don't, because they're trying to keep the agenda and some sense of momentum around that which they came to Washington to accomplish. And they know if they do accomplish, President Trump will agree with and sign. So they've all sort of gone through this process of biting their tongue, holding back, and sticking to their agenda, their knitting, whatever cliche you want to use. Paul Ryan has probably done that more publicly and conspicuously than any other Republican, save for Mitch McConnell, who's even more circumspect in what he says and, more importantly, what he doesn't say about President Trump. So all the Republicans have gone through this. But as I said earlier, and I think most people who are joining us for this conversation agree with me, maybe absent immigration, that's one area. Everything else is finished. There'll be appropriations this year, but that's essentially put within the foundation of a 2-year budget deal. There's nothing else going on that is going to take any particular legislative creativity or political thrust. And if anything, Paul Ryan's decision not to seek re-election will send a signal to every rank-and-file Republican in the House: focus relentlessly on your job to win re-election. If you're staying, spend all your time on that. Raise money, get back to your district, work your local issues, get out of Washington, and save yourself for whatever comes next. And what could come next, because of the not debilitating but certainly depressive effect Paul Ryan's announcement will have on fundraising, is going to be made more difficult.
Mike, let me go back to you and ask you, okay, so if we assume that the legislative agenda is dead for this year with the announcement that Speaker Ryan is not seeking re-election, I wonder then what it means for all the investigations that are happening in and around the White House. In the last couple of months, Republicans, more so on the House and perhaps on the Senate, have been reluctant to even pass some kind of legislation that would protect, for example, the special counsel's office and the investigation of Robert Mueller. I'm guessing, since, as Major just pointed out, that Ryan is going to tell all of his colleagues who are staying that they've got to focus on getting reelected, and if you want to be reelected, you probably are going to continue to toe the line when it comes to this investigation, which is to suggest, in some instances, as some conservatives have that, for example, Robert Mueller is exceeding his authority.
Well, that's a great point, and think what the White House has hanging over it. So Major and I together covered President Bush 43, President George W. Bush 43's administration, when his White House suddenly confronted a Democratic House. And it's a nightmare for the White House because they suddenly have subpoena power. They can ask you about all kinds of budget questions. They can try to get documents. They can have you down there testifying. So even putting aside the threat of impeachment action, which is very real, having the opposing party control the House vastly complicates your life in the West Wing, even putting aside the fact that you're not going to be able to get much done. Now, in this case, add to the fact that there's a lot of momentum among House Democrats to begin impeachment proceedings as soon as they have the gavel back. Now, of course, as your viewers know, the House can vote to impeach. The Senate, still controlled by Republicans and probably still controlled by Republicans after this election, would have to convict. So there's a lot of steps in that, and that's why we say impeachment action, impeachment drama, all of that is going to kick up as soon as Democrats get more mojo, and if you have Speaker Pelosi restored or another Democratic speaker, they're going to have their own drama on that side of whether or not a new generation should get the gavel this time.
Ed, Mike just mentioned that, there's a good possibility that the Senate will still be controlled by the Republicans after the midterm elections. But I wanted to ask you about the impact of Paul Ryan not running again, the impact that it will have on the Senate, on Mitch McConnell. Does it put more pressure on him to make sure that the Senate remains Republican?
Oh, absolutely. And he's been sounding the alarms in recent interviews as well, saying that he knows a storm is brewing. He just doesn't know if it's a Category 3, 4, or 5 hurricane. That was designed, I think, to sort of scare supporters and donors to keep donating and helping out where they can, and also to remind Republican incumbents that they have to step up their game. And the Senate map is getting increasingly more difficult for Republicans. We've been focused most of the past year and a half on the House, but consider that their most embattled incumbent, Dean Heller out in Nevada, is facing a tough challenge from a Democrat. We have at least one, maybe two competitive Senate races in Arizona, should the unthinkable happen with John McCain, if he at least steps down later this year. You have a trickier than expected Senate contest in Mississippi, where Thad Cochran has now stepped down, and a strong Democrat, Mike Espy, the former congressman, is running. And in Tennessee, the Republican candidate to replace Bob Corker is trailing the Democrat, Phil Bredesen, in recent polling. So it is a mess to some extent, or certainly not going as smoothly as it could for Republicans in the Senate, which does raise the prospect. But I think Mike's point is correct. At this point, you're probably looking at a divided Congress, but all of those things, of course, could change. To the point, by the way, about who would replace him, I want to just remind people of one thing when it comes to the future of House Republican ranks. Certainly Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise are well-liked and well-regarded by all of their colleagues. And certainly Steve Scalise has had a hell of a year, given what happened to him last summer and how he has rebounded so magnificently from the shooting and assassination attempt on a ball field in Northern Virginia. But let's not forget, when he rose to his whip position a few years ago, there were questions raised about his associations with certain groups and individuals in Louisiana who are seen to be or to support white supremacy. He hasn't entirely shaken that. And one wonders if you won't see some concern expressed, if not by Republicans, certainly by Democrats, about the possibility of having somebody in such a high senior position who has had associations with such organizations and people. I've talked to Democrats. I know there are some Republicans who keep it in the back of their mind when they talk about the potential future for Scalise. It is one thing to just consider as this leadership race continues.
All right. Mike Allen, co-founder of Axios, thank you so much for joining us to talk about all this. Ed O'Keefe, we thank you as well.